In the first part of this series, we learned about 42nd Boyd, the real-life Maverick. Like the protagonist featured in the film Top Gun, John Boyd was loud, brash, cocky, but also tall and lanky. He would talk down to any general and spoke the truth as he saw it, no matter how much it pissed off his superiors. He did not fit in at the Pentagon, with all of its careerists pushing for bigger pieces of the budget and advocating for more and more expensive fighter jet projects. So John Boyd quickly began to associate himself with the smartest outsiders at the Pentagon. Together they formed a secret network commonly referred to as the Fighter Mafia. Their objective was to get the government to fund the right aircrafts. In fact, John Boyd was originally brought to the Pentagon in the 1960s by a general who disliked the ideas of an outsider whiz kid who was constantly advocating for CAS, or close air support. The general was pulling together a group of eggheads like Boyd to disgrace this young upstart. But when the general left Boyd alone in the room with his opponent, Pierre Sprey, Boyd and Sprey quickly became fast friends and co-conspirators. Boyd spent the great majority of his career in the Pentagon pushing for cheaper, lightweight, more maneuverable air-to-air combat fighter jets. Sprey spent his time in the Pentagon pushing for a small, cheap, ugly plane called the A-10 Warthog. Sprey interviewed the soldiers on the ground to find out what it was that they really needed. Based on their feedback, he developed a plane for air-to-ground close combat support with plating on the bottom to defend it from those firing on it from below. Together, John Boyd and Pierre Sprey worked underhandedly for years to outmaneuver their superiors and get the Air Force to produce the A-10 Warthog and eventually the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Two aircrafts that would later be described as the most important aircraft ever made by the Air Force. The Air Force at the time only wanted aircraft that was more expensive. One Air Force general said he did not want to send Spray's A-10 Hogs to the Gulf. They're cheap, they're ugly, and they're slow. Much of the news about the aerial side of the war was devoted to the stealth bomber. But the A-10 had a bigger effect on the campaign than any other aircraft. It was the aircraft most feared by Iraqi troops. They called it the Black Death. Iraqi POWs said other aircraft came in, made a quick strike, and were gone. But the A-10 lingered over the battlefield, and when the pilot sighted a target, the deadly 30mm cannon released destruction such as ground troops had never seen. The general added, "I take back all the bad things I have ever said about the A-10. I love them. They're saving our." Long after their success in pushing these projects through to production, and after retreating from his work at the Pentagon out of disgust with the bureaucracy, Pierre Sprey saw a TV clip of the A-10 landing at the time of the Gulf War. The aircraft had gaping holes in the fuselage. Half of the tail was shot away, and the sky could be seen through an enormous hole in the wing. The pilot crawled down from the smoking airplane, then turned and kissed it. Sprey laughed. It was one of the greatest moments of his life to see that the airplane whose design he influenced was the only aircraft in theater that could bring its pilot home after suffering such damage. Here's a classic story of John Boyd. It's one of the many you'll find in the book about him titled Boyd, the Fighter Pilot Who Changed the Art of War, which I highly recommend if you like good biographies. One night in 1962, one of the most important men in the defense industry, Harry Hilliker, was having a drink with an Air Force officer at the Officers Club. He worked for General Dynamics and was project engineer for the F-111, the pride of the Air Force. He and this officer were quietly having a drink and talking of the wonders of the F-111, how the British had ordered a large number, how the Navy was going to cover its carrier decks with the plane, and how the F-111 was quickly on its way to becoming the greatest airplane in the history of the Air Force, the envy of the world. Hilliker found he was constantly being distracted by noise from the bar. A group of young fighter pilots clustered around an older guy who was holding court, talking in a voice heard all over the bar and waving a cigar as he described various fighter maneuvers. Occasionally, the young pilots broke out in uproarious laughter. Hilliker tilted his head toward the bar and said, "Now there's a man who thinks he's the greatest fighter pilot in the world." The host looked toward the bar, then looked back towards Hilliker and smiled. "He might well be. That's John Boyd." Hilliker shrugged. "Never heard of him." "I'll introduce you." No thanks, I don't like loudmouths." But the officer had already moved toward the bar and was talking to Boyd, telling him about the VIP, and asking Boyd to come and meet him. The two men were walking back to the table. Hilliker took a deep breath and hoped that after the introduction, Boyd would return to his cronies. But before Hilliker could even say a word, Boyd made a head-on attack, and the first words out of his mouth were, "My name is John Boyd, and I'm a fighter pilot, and I understand you work on the F-111. And what I want to know is why you guys built a god 85,000-pound airplane and called it a fighter." "It's a fighter bomber," Hilliker said, somewhat taken aback. Boyd poked Hilliker in the chest 3 or 4 times, took a puff off his cigar and said, "Yeah, well, last time I looked, an F in front of an airplane meant it was a fighter. That thing is a piece of It's too big to be a fighter, and that goddamn little wing it's got, it must take 2 states to turn the thing around. I'll tell you something else. The pilot can't see behind and he can't see out the right window. He has to depend on his co-pilot to tell him what's out there." Hilliker gritted his teeth. The project manager for the F-111 did not have to listen to this from a loudmouthed fighter pilot. Before he could reply, Boyd was off again. "It's too goddamn big, too goddamn expensive, too goddamn underpowered, and it's just not worth a good goddamn." He moved closer to Hilliker. His voice rose. "How much extra weight does that swing wing add to the airplane? 20%? Boyd didn't wait for an answer. He poked Hilliker in the chest again. "The entire weight of the wing goes through that pivot pin, and you hide it all in that big glove. You'll be getting fatigue and stress cracks in that before it's got 500 hours on it. And the amount of drag you've created is aerodynamic bull. That pivot adds weight and degrades performance. Plus, you can't sweep the wing back fast enough in combat to make a difference. The low-speed performance is lousy, the high-speed performance is worse, and the goddamn thing won't maneuver." Hilliker stared at Boyd. Fighter pilots usually talk in generalities when they criticize an airplane. They say it's a pig or that it needs 5 miles of runway to get off the ground, but they don't know enough to hone in on design specifics. An engineer trying to get hard information out of a fighter pilot is like a man trying to nail jello to a tree. Thus, Hilliker was more than a little shocked to hear the loudmouthed pilot ask about things that were only beginning to be whispered about in the back rooms of General Dynamics. Hilliker did not know he was looking at the only man in the world who knew more about the capabilities of the F-111 than he did. Boyd had done some preliminary EM calculations on the F-111 and knew what a terrible mistake the Air Force was making. Boyd knew that the bureaucracy always came up with an aircraft such as the F-111. The Air Force looked at technology rather than the mission. And if they did consider the mission, it was always the fashionable mission of the day. Hilliker pulled out a chair. "Sit down, John." Hilliker was supervising construction on what would turn out to be one of the most scandal-ridden aircraft in U.S. history. Boyd was the first to publicly say what in a few years everyone would know. The Air Force was seduced by swing wing technology, a technology that ultimately would ruin 2 generations of airplanes. The underpowered Navy F-14 Tomcat is a swing wing, and the performance is so poor the pilots call it a Tom Turkey. The B-1 bomber, one of the most trouble-plagued aircraft in the Air Force inventory, also a swing wing. After only a few minutes of highly technical engineering discussion, Boyd and Hilliker had cleaned off the table and began writing on cocktail napkins and passing them back and forth, covering them with engineering data, formulae, drag polars, and lift coefficients. At that table, they began developing what they thought could be the ultimate fighter aircraft. A few years later, they would join together to develop what would later become the F-16 Fighting Falcon. The Pentagon was filled with careerists, all competing to get a bigger piece of the pie. Officers advocating for their branch of the military to get more millions of tax-paying dollars to build planes that were built bigger, went higher, faster, and farther. They were basically salesmen for private weapons contractors, so the bigger and more expensive the project was, the better. But John Boyd and the fighter mafia thought differently. They knew that spending more did not get you more. When one plane was designed to do everything, it specialized in nothing. It might bring in more of the budget, but it didn't serve the real purpose of defending the nation, and it wasted the taxpayers' money. They understood that if an aircraft was cheaper, you could build more of them with the same budget. And if they were better, then they could defend the soldiers and save lives. So Boyd and his acolytes conspired to get the government to do what they thought was the right thing. They advocated for smaller, cheaper planes, and came up with math to prove that they were better. They set out to expose the hidden costs of the bureaucrats' favorite false doctrine of bigger, higher, faster, farther. Eventually, one of John Boyd's conspirators found a place and a time to meet once a week at a private officers' club on Wednesday nights. John Boyd, Tom Christie, Pierre Spray, and many of their colleagues would gather, tell stories of how they were handling higher-ups, confess failures of getting handled by their opponents, and occasionally they even developed new ideas. The Pentagon bureaucracy eventually found out about the Wednesday night happy hour and occasionally sent spies. Standoffish and obviously not part of the band of brothers, these spies were easily detected. Boyd might be in his expository mode, deliberating with 24 people circled around him, when someone would point out a couple of men across the room. "John, they're spies, tone it down." Boyd said, "F them," and he would talk even louder. When a young officer of real merit was assigned to Boyd's office, or came to consult with him, knowing that John Boyd would tell him the truth, Boyd would eventually come to the point in the conversation where the officer had to contend with the corrupting nature of always trying to please your superior. Perhaps the young soldier's commanding officer had asked him to hide the real figures, or write a report that fudged the numbers. These intelligent, idealistic young officers wanted to do what was right, but in a hierarchical bureaucracy like the military, you would never be promoted if you didn't do absolutely everything even hinted at by your superiors. So John Boyd would sit them down and ask them, "Do you want to be somebody, or do you want to do something?" The implication here was that if you did everything you were told and never ruffled any feathers, then you might have to keep quiet when you know you should speak, and advocate for projects that you know are not right, and lose a little of your soul in the process of moving up the ranks. Eventually, you would land a position of power, become someone, and become a member of the club. But have lost your spine along the way, betrayed a few friends, and in the end, you would probably accomplish very little. Or, on the other hand, you could act on truth, hold to your ideals, do the real work of government, and really accomplish something. But along the way, you might get a negative review from a less idealistic superior and get relegated to meaningless assignments. The officers who conspired with Boyd chose to do something. And like Boyd prophesied, many of them failed to make the promotions they likely deserved and rarely achieved any rank above colonel. Boyd described himself as a dumb air pilot, but he had an incisive mind. He said that he only had an IQ of 90, but it forced him to be efficient. He would think a problem through hour after hour, night after night, and researching widely about them for years on end. He studied a wide variety of subjects and studied all the ancient books on strategy, warfare, and creativity. He would call up younger subordinates really late and talk to them for hours in the middle of the night, ranting about his new ideas and insights. He was also crazy good at math, at least the math that applied to aeronautics. And when he looked at endless pages of energy maneuverability calculations, he said the pages sang to him. Unlike our favorite film's fighter pilot, Boyd could do more than just look good in a pair of aviators. Actually, Tom Cruise is not the only one who looks good in a pair of aviators. At the Pentagon, Boyd figured out a way to condense all the critical factors used to judge fighter jets down to one critical factor: how well they maintain and regain energy. His theory became known as energy maneuverability, or EN theory. This not only helped him to revolutionize how the Air Force and the Navy design aircraft, but it also helped to answer the age-old question among his generation of fighters, the ones depicted in Top Gun. How could an F-14 defeat a MiG so often? The Soviet MiGs were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the Navy's F-14 and the Air Force's F-86. So why were the Americans, like the ones featured in Top Gun, winning 10-1 against the MiGs? To find out how Boyd solved this puzzle, we will explore the problem and apply Boyd's math in Part 3. Be sure to watch Part 1 if you skipped it, and ring the notification bell to find out when my next videos get posted.